Welcome to another episode on The Wrong Kind of Black. Today I'm going to be talking about how I am coping with what I would call selfish and narcissistic parents. I'm going to try my best to ensure this episode doesn't turn from a podcast to a therapy session, since I feel like I've got a lot of baggage in this department. Nonetheless, I thought it would be a good idea to share my experience of having narcissistic and selfish parents, as A, it might help you to have gratitude for the relationship you have with one or both of your parents. B, it might give you comfort knowing you're not the only person with a narcissistic parent or parents. Or C, it might help you to take perspective of the relationship you have with your parents or children and allow you to take steps to preclude the possibility of the building of resentment in the relationship you have with your parents or your children. I'm not going to lie, it's difficult for me to talk about this matter, as it's a societal misdemeanor to criticize your own parents. The Bible tells us to honor our parents, and even though I'm not the most religious person in the world, it makes sense why that nugget of wisdom would be important for a functioning society. I'm guessing many of our parents take advantage of this biblical teaching and use it to justify their parenting and potentially to gaslight their own children. For the record, I don't have any children. I aspire to have children someday, and I've found the older I get, the more prepared I feel to be able to prioritize someone else in my life. I've heard different arguments as to the best time to have children. Some say it's better having children when you're young, as it allows you to take responsibility from an early age and grow up quicker. Others say it's better to have children when you're older, as you tend to be in a better financial position and are a lot wiser. It's a funny one with children, as I bet most people who have had children never felt fully prepared, as it's difficult to plan having children, and I guess it's just a part of human nature. But I do hate the argument, which my own parents have used against me several times, that because I don't have children, I have no idea how difficult it is to raise them. They are right to a degree. I don't know what it's like having a child of my own that is there every day who is completely dependent on me. I don't know what it feels like to feel like you have to be the best version of yourself all the time around your children to act as a perfect role model. I don't know what it's like to constantly balance love and discipline to make sure that I'm allowing my children to become independent, yet feel listened to and heard at the same time. I don't know what it's like to deal with puberty and the fluctuating emotions of a teenager. I don't know what it's like to try to prepare my child for an intimate relationship so they can have a happy marriage, or set my child up for a career that guarantees stability. And there's probably a lot of other things that I don't know. But what I do know, even without having any children, is that all children want to feel loved, supported, and championed throughout their entire life. I know that it's difficult to cater to every single child need when you're working a full-time job or are busy trying to figure out how to improve the quality of your family's life. And I know how expensive it can be to provide for a child. But I also know that raising a child doesn't stop when they turn 18 or leave home. And I also know that having a child is an opportunity to have the best relationship you've ever had with anyone in your life. So, let's get back to this episode. Coping with selfish and narcissistic parents. I don't know whether or not selfishness and narcissism are mutually exclusive, but selfishness must be a characteristic of narcissism, since a narcissistic person only sees a world from their perspective. Whether they're cognizant or not of the damage they cause to other people is irrelevant, so that thought process inevitably leads to selfish actions. So that's why I'm talking about both. So I did Jordan Peterson's self-authoring in 2021, just before I came back to the UK. The self-authoring allows you to write about your experiences, positive or negative, and write a thorough analysis of what effects you think those experiences have had on you. It was the first time I had written about these things, which I found extremely therapeutic. I decided to take chunks out and send it to my mum, thinking she might be the most receptive parent to the experiences that I talk about, and was hoping that she would want to know about how I felt about each experience. I hoped that I could gain some closure by sending it to her. So that's what I've decided to read to you in this episode. I also think it's the most efficient way for you to fully understand the relationship I have with my parents and where most of my resentment comes from. I don't hate my parents, by the way. I would say that I've forgiven them for how they've raised me, but I've not forgotten what they did. So I have about 10 stories to tell you, each with some form of analysis, so bear with me. Then I'm going to finish the episode by telling you how my mother responded to what I wrote her. I'll start with the first story, which happened when I was in primary school, and it refers to some batteries that were surreptitiously taken from the house smoke alarm. One morning, my brother and I were woken up by our indignant parents. We were told that the batteries to the smoke alarm in our house had disappeared, and they had surmised that one of us had removed them from the detector. I was confused but confident as I knew I hadn't taken them. My brother and I both denied the accusation. My parents remained insistent upon the fact one of us was prevaricating. My parents stored a cane that was about 1 metre in length and a couple of centimetres wide in the garage they had at their disposal for times they wished to rebuke us corporally. My dad would strike the palm of our hands up to 4 or 5 times at his will. We were beaten with the cane one after another, with intermittent breaks in between. He did this until one of us confessed. This went on for several rounds until my brother finally confessed. I was completely incognizant of my brother's comportment and deceitful behaviour. Why he lied and allowed the punishments to continue mystifies me to this day. Being innocent, I expected a full apology from my dad, as I was beaten in the end for no apparent reason. My dad was making tea for himself when he apologised from afar and didn't even bother to look up when he said sorry. So now I'm going to read my analysis of the effect that I believe this experience had on me. This experience allowed me to understand that the inequity I ever suffer can extend to custodians within my own home. It made me perceive my father in a distinct manner, now understanding our relationship is distant inasmuch as me or my brother are culpable of any crime. The anger he felt at the misdemeanour extended towards someone's innocence, that his feelings prevailed to the relationship he had with me personally. It was one of the few moments in my life that I expected a sincere apology from my father, even though it would have been unprecedented to date. It permitted me to understand that I was indeed alone, and that my existence was somewhat cumbersome on his life insofar as me or my brother inconvenienced him to any degree. It didn't change my opinion on what equity ever was. It simply allowed me to understand that this was not a principle he ever lived by, because simply he would have forgone his attempt to interject such an illogical and irrational precept into his children's philosophical understanding of life. This next story happened in secondary school, and it happened when one of the kids from our neighbourhood knocked on for us. I would have been in year 7 or 8 when this transpired. My brother and I had begun spending more time playing and messing around with one of our neighbours, Paul. Paul lived on the street parallel to ours. We had become addicted to an online game in which money is bought and earned in a virtual world called Habbo Hotel. We got greedy, deceptive and competitive with one another. People could scam one another with little information about somebody's account, which is what we were complicit to when Paul knocked on for us. It was around 9 p.m. when Paul knocked on for us. We were having an argument with him about whether we had scammed him or not, which we were denying. My dad heard us arguing with Paul at the door and was completely aware we often consorted with him. He told us to shut the door in his face and complained about the time we were talking with him. We were completely reluctant to do this considering Paul was exasperated and that it would have been completely uncivil to do, considering we often spent time with him. As we demurred, my father repeated his demand as we hesitatingly closed the door in Paul's face. The embarrassment we both felt was unparalleled. The courtesy that was extended to us by all the parents of our friends in the neighbourhood never fell short of our expectations. Our father had completely disrespected our friend and his family by ordering us to close the door in his face, which left us incensed. My father was still frustrated by this inconvenience and summoned us to bed. The anger and hatred we felt towards him was unprecedented. As we laid in bed, wide awake in our bunk beds in our bedroom, we began a philippic that damned our father to the fires of perdition. This must have lasted around 20 minutes. All the while, my parents were stood just outside the door that was open ajar, wide enough for them to hear everything we said. They startled us by turning on the bedroom light and entering. We were at this point fully cognizant that everything we said was heard. Our father began by threatening us both, while my mother began to cry. It was the most uncomfortable situation that we had ever experienced thus far with our parents, and we were fearful to the core of what was to follow. So this is my analysis on this experience. The experience manifested my mother's complicity to my father's physical, psychological, and emotional abuse. My brother and I had imagined that this experience would shed light upon the suffering we both endured, albeit externalizing our emotions in what was a somewhat unpalatable manner for our parents. Our parents' response to this experience demonstrated people's intransigence to individual responsibility, even when it looks them dead on in the face. People are capable of arrogantly and ignorantly externalizing their misfortunes to almost every single someone or something but themselves. They wonder why they suffer calamities without ever finding themselves to blame. They writhe in their own self-pity and expect others' sorrow to prevail to their own wrongdoings, imprudence, or stupidity. They expect the world to conform to them rather than the inverse. This experience has taught me to be merciless to those who shirk duty to self-reflect, insofar as them being remiss in their obligation does not negatively affect my life or those close to me. So my continued analysis of this particular event. This was a negative experience for our nuclear family. My parents were profoundly offended by the words we uttered. The event was a culmination of the failure of me and my brother to live up to the ludicrous standards of our father. My brother and I were humiliated by him. It was an attempt to subject us to his arbitrary authority over us. Our words can be perceived as a cry for help, but our parents decided not to perceive them as such. They perceived them as an attack on their roles in parenthood. They were obfuscated by the idea that we were intrinsically malevolent, albeit the truth being that they had palpably failed us as parents, and we were now old enough to be cognizant of this. The idea that we could have sat our parents down to communicate our emotions about the way we were treated would have been considered as an affront, and my father would have invariably been intransigent to our sentiments. The reaction of our parents left no room for us to address the underlying issues in our nuclear family, and my brother and I were subject to suffer the ramifications for our untoward behaviour. So this is what I've written about the effects of this event. The reaction of our parents can be analogized with a long prison sentence. We were now subject to the absolute control of our parents. Being in our early teenage years, we realized that the way we were treated would possibly even exacerbate now that our father will feel his actions are justified. The reaction of our mother specifically dimmed the light we saw at the end of the tunnel into total darkness. She was now complicit in his despotism. It formulated an inferiority complex that would now stain the relationship we could ever have with anyone in authority. We truly believed that our parents would repent and seek reconciliation. We were completely errant in our perception. We knew now that the relationship that we would have with our parents would continue to deteriorate. The notion that our father refuses to take responsibility for any of his comportment towards us confirmed the perpetual distance that we would now have with him. The complicity of our mother signified our distance with her will equally and inevitably take place. The next story happened on a family holiday in the Dominican Republic when I was 16 years old. At the inception of our final year of middle school, our parents decided to take me and my brother, along with our elder sister, on a family vacation to the Dominican Republic for 14 days. We would be situated on a holiday resort that consisted of sumptuous hotel rooms, a swimming pool and a restaurant on a picturesque hotel on the beach. My siblings and I naturally assumed that our parents would be spending time together, while we would be off enjoying ourselves on the resort as we were already in our late teens by this point. Unbeknownst to us, our parents had a different idea. Albeit loathing our dictatorial father, he anticipated us, as males, spending time together while my mother and sister would spend most of their time in each other's company. This awkwardly came to light as my dad initiated the autocracy by forbidding us to go to another area of the resort without informing him. This left me and my brother persistently discommoded as we hated being around him. He was controlling, solicitous, irritable, and had no regard for our privacy or desires. Inasmuch as the resort accommodated teenagers such as me and my brother at the time, the amenities at the hotel ceased to be at our disposal, as their usage required the consent of our dictator. This completely ruined the vacation for us. There was one particular night when the whole family was sat at a bar on the beach. Not wanting to be around our parents any longer, we machinated a plan to go to another area of the resort without our parents knowing. We succeeded, and our parents followed suit not long after, finding out we had intentionally absconded. Rather than picking up on the social cue that we didn't want to be around them all the time, instead, my father complained and chastised us, justifying his explanation to the resort not being safe for us to be alone together. My brother and I were 16 years old. The resort was closed off on a strip that only catered towards travellers who were staying in one of those hotels. In fact, my brother and I were mistaken to be 18 or older, as the wristbands we were given when checking into the hotel were for adults, to prevent underage guests from ordering alcoholic drinks at the resort. We couldn't have been safer. Throughout the 14 days we stayed there, it became pronounced that my parents were avoiding having to spend time alone with one another. So my analysis. Inasmuch as my mother attempted to portray our nuclear family as being a functional one, this experience ascertained that it was a dysfunctional one, much to the dismay of everyone involved. Our experience could have easily been a predominantly memorable and positive one. I am entirely aware of the privilege it is to be able to have an experience staying on a resort in a tropical country during my teenage years. However, I believe the complications of my parents' relationship were passed down to us wittingly. Rather than allow us the space to enjoy our time on the resort as teenagers and trust us, our parents decided to shirk the responsibility of re-establishing their relationship with our absence. Instead, we were encumbered with the task of entertaining their needs and being subjected to their authority. We were manipulated into believing what they were doing was normal. To say that our experience was marred by their intervention would be an understatement. It helped us to realize that our parents were unable to establish a relationship independent of our presence. So this next story happened when my dad took me and my twin brother to Nigeria for the second time when we were both 18 years old. My father visits Nigeria every couple of years. He hails from the erstwhile capital Lagos, which is the second most populous city in Africa. We had visited Nigeria once already with our parents when we were 6 years old, which, being young, we remember being a pleasant experience. The decision for me and my brother to join our dad on the visit was impelled by the news that his mother, who was admired and respected by the whole family, was sick and that it might be the last time we ever saw her again, which not soon after proved to be true. Our elder sister didn't go with us, as she had already gone with my father the last time he went to visit Lagos. We were to spend 2 weeks there before we began our final year of high school. Our trip to Nigeria was somewhat eventful, even though we spent the majority of our time at my dad's brother's house, where our closest cousins and his mother were residing. Being non-native to Nigeria, we were advised not to drink the water there, as it was unpurified. We were dependent on the bottled water that our dad provided for us every day. Lagos is a coastal city that sits on the Gulf of Guinea, which the equator runs right through. All three of us were sharing the same bottled water. Our meekness can be attributed to the oppression my father subjected me and my brother to, which is why we never impugned him about having to share one bottle of water. My dad would bring out another bottle from an unknown location if we finished it. Our cousins often bought what appeared to be plastic packets of water from the convenience stores. We were that thirsty that these packets of water became tantalizing, and we were caught by our father and uncle drinking from them. We were told by our uncle that we might as well be drinking water from the tap, as the water from these packets were just as unsafe to drink. My dad must have known from that moment we were dehydrated and could have informed us that there was plenty of bottled water at our disposal to drink from. Instead, when we finished a bottle early, he complained that we were drinking too fast and that the bottle was to be shared from. During the second week of our trip there, we discovered that the bottled water was coming from my uncle's bedroom, which is where my dad would get the bottled water from. We continued to be relatively dehydrated for the rest of our stay in Nigeria. The analysis. My experience in Nigeria shed light upon my father's willingness to manipulation and prevarication to forego inconveniencing himself. His contemptible efforts are something my brother and I can never forget. The idea of depriving one's own offspring to the most necessary substance on the planet works counterintuitively to human nature. It manifested the unfortunate dearth of love he must have for at least 2 of his own children, and can only allow us to extrapolate the diabolical nature of his genuine feelings towards his own children. His attempts to conceal what actually transpired will not go unchallenged. His attempts to conceal the veracity of our claims will be made an arduous one. The inevitability of him accounting for this kind of malevolence is what he must anticipate. Inasmuch as he may be forgiven for his comportment, it can never be forgotten. My brother and I have been subjected to assume the responsibility for him to account for his deplorable actions during our stay in Nigeria under his tutelage. So the analysis goes on to say, our experience in Nigeria ascertained our father's disdain to our relationship. The suppression we were subjected to precipitated our meek demeanour in approaching him and challenging him on what should be a trivial issue. Our behaviour was indicative of anyone who was in deficit of hydration, which we assumed would suffice considering he did in fact respond to it. His plaintive response corroborates our assumption that he would be inconvenienced by our necessity to be hydrated. We were already acclimatized to discovering ways we could inconvenience him as little as possible. We were oppressed. He was the only person responsible for our supply of water, and he knew it. We all knew it. We even communicated this to our mother when we got back, and he felt coerced by her to apologize to us, knowing that he had ample opportunity to tell us that we could have had as much water as we wanted during our stay there, which is what he purported. He lied, but it was now over. It was one fewer thing he now had to fret about. So this part is the effect this event has had on me. We were now completely aware that our dad was worthy of casting aspersions on. It didn't necessarily matter because we were disposed to leave our home the first opportunity we could. The last memories we had with our father were vivid enough to substantiate the cruelty he subjected us to. We remained meek and oppressed until we left. The events pursuant to this would be conducive to his totalitarian behaviour. We knew that he was incapable of attempting to absolve himself from his behaviour towards us. We knew that we would never have the privilege of having a mutually beneficial relationship with our father. We knew that he didn't value our relationship, that he never would. My relationship with my dad has only evoked shame for not having had the privilege of having the support of a father during adulthood, albeit him still being around, as well as anger. My memories of his conduct towards us inspire sheer exasperation. This has precipitated an ungainly interaction with those who lionize their parents. I continue to remain expectant as to if and when he plans to seek expiation for his wrongdoings towards both me and my brother. This next story refers to the time that our little brother was born. Our parents delivered the news that our mum was pregnant and was expecting another child when my brother and I were 17 years old. Our sister is 2.5 years older than us. The news was met with delight and we began preparations to welcome another member into our family. This era was marked by a turbulent period with the relationship my brother and I had with our father, as he became even more controlling, aggressive and violent with us. My brother and I became more ambitious, more disciplined and more aware during this period, which probably exasperated the relationship we already had with our father. My father's philosophy was predicated on arbitrary, doctrinaire and sanctimonious values which incrementally became more pronounced the older we got. Our sister seemed to have evaded this, being a girl, which meant our dad treated her with more clemency. One might imagine that the introduction of a new family member would bring us all closer together. However, the chasm in our relationship we had with our father manifested itself in even more capricious ways. The climax of this was the day our mother and father returned home from the hospital. With them not being present at home, our father irrationally expected me and my brother to take the initiative to clean the whole house without anything being communicated to us. His anger precipitated a violent response from his frustration of us not being as submissive and docile as he would have liked us to be. The frustration might be justified, but his violent response was unwarranted, which left me and my brother feeling vexed and psychologically and emotionally abused. So my analysis. Even the birth of an immediate family member did not suffice to quell the combustibility of my dad. The very first day my younger brother was to spend at our home would be fraught with violence, anger and aggression. Exonerating me and my brother was out of the question for him even on this day. Establishing a novel, loving relationship with us was also beyond the scope of his imagination, considering we now had another family member in the picture. Whether this was done wittingly or inadvertently is now impertinent. Nonetheless, my memory of my younger brother's reception into our home is tarnished with my father's inability to temper his frustrations and antipathy for me and my brother. That rather than my younger brother's arrival being a pretext for peace, it would be a pretext for further disdain from my father's perspective. That rather than our younger brother's inception being a catalyst for something better, it would be a catalyst for something even worse. And although our younger brother's incomprehension of the complexity of the relationship my brother and I hold with our dad, it is us who are expected to exonerate him, albeit our father never showing mercy to us. So the next story I called My Dad Gets Sucker Punched. Moving out of our house to embark on our studies in a different city was the best thing to happen to us when my brother and I went to university. We were emancipated from the suppression our dad subjected us to, alongside his arbitrary, violent and commandeering nature. We were ignorant of the fact that we were still somewhat dependent on our parents, as we were to reside at university solely during the academic year. Nevertheless, we still relished our freedom and avoided returning home in so far as possible. After the first term had passed, students began leaving the student residence to rejoin their families to celebrate Christmas. My brother and I were apprehensive about going back for the palpable reasons I have given. My dad, knowing that he was gradually losing his dominance over us, added to the foreboding sensation that something dreadful was about to transpire. It did. It commenced with my dad complaining about us getting up late. He began a tirade about how lazy, useless and presumptuous we were, with scorn and invective. His diatribe was incommensurate with our actions, and I therefore seized the opportunity to make him eat his words. Knowing he was no longer feared, he responded with the threat of violence. I refused to capitulate, even when he was right up in my face. Ineluctably, he threw the first blows. I didn't respond to him as I knew I already achieved what I wanted from him, the understanding that we were no longer subjected to his tyranny. My brother and sister attempted to thwart him in his efforts to subdue me with violence. My father took my brother's comportment as an affront and capitalized on the opportunity to strike him in his face. My brother responded likewise by smiting him in the face with his fist. This caused him to bleed profusely. Understanding now that his efforts to submit us with violence would invariably fall short, he decided to spitefully go for our possessions by throwing our suitcases down the stairs and kicking us out of the house. We perforce returned to our student accommodation in Liverpool. After a few months, we reached out to our father using our mother as the intermediary. As we sat down at our auntie's home to reconcile, my dad denied ever hitting my brother in the face as the instigator and insisted upon the fact that my brother had hit him without reason. Nonetheless, his prevarication was overlooked and the reconciliation was somewhat a success for the time being. So the analysis. The formidable figure that oppressed us for as long as we remembered now shriveled in our estimations. We were now vindicated in our postulations of him suppressing us by way of sheer blackmail. The physical advantage he had had over us during our earlier teenage years had now expired, and he resorted to blackmailing us by threatening to abandon us. His persistence to prevaricate about what had actually transpired was another reminder of his obstinance and arrogance. He paved the way for absolute independence for me in my life, allowing me to aspire towards never being ingenuous enough to rely on him again, knowing he has proclivities towards blackmail. Ironically, blackmail was one of the things he anathematized during our childhood, yet it was the tool he had used to control us. Knowing now that his control has ineluctably dissipated over time, his interaction with us is predicated on ignominy and failure. So my analysis of this event. This was an experience that was precipitated by negative circumstances, albeit engendering a positive change for me and my brother. Our emancipation from our father's rule was finally proclaimed. The opportunity to confront our father had been pending for several years. Our father once again vindicated us that his efforts to oppress us were merely predicated on blackmail and violence. Our father's insufferable behaviour was challenged and put at a halt. Our dad perpetrated the assault, and I knew I ought to be courageous in seizing this opportunity. I was prudent in understanding that I did not need to retaliate to his attempts to physically abuse me. My brother's decision to retaliate using physical violence was completely tenable from my perspective. This was an experience that had to happen. Our comportment that led to his frustrations were typical of students who were visiting home. We didn't need to endure his abuse any longer. This was our declaration of independence. This was our way of communicating that we were no longer subject to his arbitrary and cruel authority. So, the effects of this event. Our declaration came with its concomitant side effects. Our parents had ceased to be a safety net for us at a time which can dictate the predispositions of relative success in a person's life. In retrospection, it is perspicuously clear that we suffered from this, albeit our liberation taking precedence to any kind of comfort we could have otherwise enjoyed. We exponentially formulated distance and independence from our parents. This limited our progression to an ostensible degree. Our psyche was rife with insecurities that we would be subject to address at least within the next decade. We felt that our dependence on our parents was now obsolete. We were now accountable for all decisions we made in our lives, albeit not necessarily having the sagacity to comprehend this. Notwithstanding this experience, our parents still rejoiced in the idea of us still having to rely on them, which galvanized us to take even more responsibility and became even more independent. Our memory of this event was a constant reminder of our parents' capability to suppress us, which estranged us even more. The next story happened when I decided to take a trip to Germany to visit a friend I had made in Spain. My dad had always claimed that if we wanted recourse for anything in the family, we ought to communicate it in advance. This felt like an excuse for never really wanting to help me or my brother if they could avoid it. The older my brother and I have become, the more cognizant we have become of the fact that our existence has been somewhat onerous to our parents' lives. This was a period in which our distance was inevitably manifesting itself, and that this was an opportunity for them to start redressing the mistakes they had made in order to incentivize us to want to maintain a relationship with them in the future. Residing in university accommodation, we witnessed many accounts of other parents still making an effort to be involved with their children's lives. Our parents seemed to do the bare minimum, justifying their reasons for not helping us out whenever they got the opportunity. There was one instance in which their justification was completely untenable, considering I had communicated my request with plenty of notice. I was to fly to Germany from Manchester, and I asked to be given a lift back from the airport at a reasonable time when I got back. My parents both had a car each, and being a student trying to make ends meet, taking a taxi home would have been extortionate for me, especially since the airport was only 15 to 20 minutes away by car from our house. When I landed at the airport, I called my mother, who demurred on the phone for around 10 minutes. She and my dad were sat at home and were both reluctant to come and pick me up. I was furious since I informed my mother before I even left England. I had to endure my father's complaints on the ride when he eventually acquiesced and blamed my mother for not having communicated with him, and thus blaming me for not having asked him directly. This is when I knew I should minimize interactions with my parents at all costs. So the analysis. Such a simple and reasonable request to my parents was hyperbolized into something extremely inconvenient and cumbersome for them. This single event represented their true nature to the entire relationship they have with me, a mere inconvenience. Sure, it is something they would do under duress, but a loving parent would avail themselves of any last opportunity to help their children who have already fled the nest. The imprudence of my parents to understand that this is one of the last memories I will have of them not prioritizing me is testament to their recklessness. The imprudence of my parents to comprehend that it will soon be them inconveniencing me is also testament to the myopic view they have of life. I have had to come to terms with the nature of our relationship. I have had to accept that my parents never truly invested time or money, or will invest in me. What I have come to terms with is simply this: my parents should not expect any high returns. You will reap what you sow. This next story refers to the time that I came out to my parents. I always thought that my mother might speculate that I'm gay. Every mother in the 21st century must speculate if one of their sons are gay, unless they're living in a box, which she was not. In my 20s, I never talked about having a girlfriend or wanting one. My brother was in a long-term relationship and had even met and lived with my mother. My mother has externalized a liberal attitude, as she has always tended to lean heavily towards the left on her political views. We have always watched reality TV shows together, which would invariably consist of at least one homosexual, and she never said anything remotely homophobic. My dad is from one of the few nations in the world that still possesses discriminatory laws or policies against homosexuality, so the odd ignorant or homophobic remark did not come to any surprise to me or my siblings. My mother was the first to find out as she asked me directly. She had heard that I had gone to a town in Spain in which a gay pride festival was being held. Rather than assuming that I had simply gone for the experience, she had known inherently that I went because I was gay. When she asked me, it was almost as if she wanted to lie about my sexuality, but having lived several years away from the family at this point, and having garnered confidence about having opened up to everyone now around me, whether they decided to accept my sexual preference or not was now on them. My mother seemed intransigent to the news. Rather than capitalizing on the opportunity to show her support, she asked me questions that portrayed her anathema towards the idea of having a gay son. About a week later, she told my dad. Knowing that my dad was homophobic and not considering whether I would like to take the reins on how information was disseminated about me, I struggled to apprehend why my mother would do something so reckless. Ineluctably, my father responded in an irrational and anachronistic way to nobody's surprise. This all transpired while I was still away living in Spain. We were approaching Christmas at this point. My brother and sister were living at home, and my brother had his girlfriend living with my parents too. I planned to come home for Christmas and had even bought return flights to England to celebrate Christmas with them. I was in frequent communication with my brother and sister who informed me of all that was happening at home. My mother was telling me things that were contradictory to what my siblings were telling me. As my flight date approached, my mother told me there was no room for me and that I should consider staying in a hotel during my stay. The emotions I felt to this message from my mother were horridly ineffable. I ignored her message and was not to speak to her or my father for the next year. The analysis. The experience has impacted the relationship I have with my parents to this day. Considering my parents were the last people to be informed of my sexual predilections, and I had already come out to my other family members and friends, their reaction dumbfounded me. I never imagined I would receive such a hateful and irrational response from my father. I never imagined my own mother would attempt to make me feel guilty about such a ridiculous expectation she had of her own child. I never imagined that the world that predominated my experiences in my life would now summarily be supplanted with the experiences I created in this new world that my parents were no longer part of. This experience allowed me to contend with the notion of conditional and unconditional love. One would have to enter with a presupposition that a child is incapable of free will insofar as a child living with their parents subjects them to the influences their parents voluntarily or involuntarily exposes them to during their formative years, throughout their teenage years into adulthood. The idea that my own parents could blame me for my sexuality is ludicrous. The notion that my parents ever attempted to formulate an environment in which my childhood needs would be controlled and consistently attended to is risible. And then to have the audacity to claim to love me, predicated on a condition they never attempted to raise me up having, is outright brash. There are several parallels that can be drawn here. Our father expecting us to be able to speak Yoruba without ever having been spoken to us in Yoruba. Our father expecting us to be Christian without ever taking us to church. Our father expecting us to read books without ever having read books himself. Expecting us to get good grades without having ever necessitated education. Expecting us to generously give them money without having ever generously given us money. Expecting me to want to visit them without them ever wanting to visit me. And the list goes on. To encapsulate, the experience has done nothing but shed light upon the skewed perception of my parents in expecting something from me without ever having reciprocated the very same thing. So my analysis of this event. My impressionability can be attributed to my expectation that this news would be received positively. My mother's initial response was hurtful and presumptuous. From my mother's perspective, her utterances must have seemed innocuous and innocent, which exasperated the issue. I did not yet have the foresight to construct my revelation in a more palatable manner, but my experience of having come out to other people already led me to believe that the listener would have the emotional quotient to understand how taxing of a task this must be for me. Nevertheless, my mum responded the way she did. It upset me, and her decision to inform my father summarily seemed callous from my part. The news was simply a biological fact as far as our society is concerned. The notion that my mother would impugn this epistemological concept at such a stage in my life was indicative of her intolerance and her disappointment. Considering the distant relationship that she and I had begun to experience, I naively believed it was an opportunity for her to demonstrate her support, which came to my chagrin. I now knew I would never have the privilege of having a supportive and open-minded parent when disclosing something so integral and personal to me. So the effects of this event. My parents' reception to my news engendered much rumination on my childhood years. I now could expiate myself from the shame and confusion I felt for not having come out earlier in life. I was now vindicated. I was now exonerated from the pusillanimity I felt for not informing others of my sexual predilections earlier. Having observed other peers come out at a relatively young age, I was now exculpated for not having simulated their actions. There was no reason. My parents were indeed intolerant. My parents did constitute the environment in which this effort was deemed impossible. My insecurity about my sexuality was attributable to their comportment in not establishing the kind of relationship in which they could be confided with such information. My decision to come out at the time I did was propitious. I was subconsciously seeking independence from them to carry out the significant task of being true to myself. I no longer needed their support. I had already built a support structure which did not include them. To their ignorance, their acceptance of my inherent sexual makeup was a test which decided whether they would become part of the entourage I had formulated since becoming independent from them. This next story is about the time my mum came to visit my brother, and not me, in Spain. My brother told me that she planned to visit me and my brother in Spain. She knew we were living in 2 different cities at the time. As I hadn't seen my younger brother for a long time, and he was growing up quickly, I was excited about the prospect of my mother and younger brother coming to visit me. Out of me and my brother, I had been away from home the longest, which is why I felt even more exhilarated by the prospect. Friends I had made in Spain often had their families and friends come in to visit them, since it was so convenient, and with Spain being a well-renowned holiday destination for many Europeans, especially Brits. My mother then informed me that she had booked her flight tickets to another city. I told her that the very day she would visit I was scheduled to work, and working in another city was impossible for me to travel to visit her and my brother due to my obligations. She had apparently been in communication with my brother, who was living in Barcelona at the time, who was able to visit, but had disregarded whether I would be able to attend or not. I was unable to, and therefore could not travel to visit them. Why my mother booked her flight tickets without asking me about my availability to travel to visit her is what I found deeply confounding. So, the analysis. This experience emphasized the lack of effort my mother and father put into distinguishing the relationship they had with each of us. The notion of killing 2 birds with 1 stone was invariably applied when dealing with us, which now has precipitated its concomitant effects. The fact that my mother will not take responsibility for this reckless mistake is testament to the indifference she had towards ensuring both of our needs are catered for, and that if one twin misses out on the experience, then at least we tried, and at least one of them could benefit from the experience. This is a reckless and impersonal way to bring up children. Inasmuch as my brother and I are identical twins, we are completely different, and now we have ostensibly different experiences of our parents visiting us while living abroad. We have different memories of how our parents interacted with us when we were children, and now we have completely different memories of the interaction we have with our parents during adulthood. So this is the final story, and this story is about when my mother visited Spain again. After my mother botched plans to visit me and my brother simultaneously while we were both living in Spain, my mother planned another trip to the Mediterranean. She planned to travel a cruise ship with her sister, who is my auntie, of course, and my younger brother. She travelled on a cruise ship that would dock at the coastal city of Barcelona and would cast off to sail the Mediterranean, including a visit to the French island Corsica. I was living in a coastal province at the time. My frustrations were founded on the fact that my visit was never necessitated by my mother, and all the while having ample time to see me. Rather than the importance of maintaining a relationship with me, or at least necessitating the relationship I had with my younger brother, she would rather invest in a trip on the very same sea the littoral province I was residing in shared with the Mediterranean. And the final analysis. This experience made my postulation about my mother's imprudence and indifference incontrovertible. A cruise around a sea where your son is living, who you have yet to visit while he was living abroad for 2 years in total, is prioritized to ensuring your son understands his worth and importance in the family, whilst the opportunity can still be capitalized on. A cruise around the Mediterranean can be enjoyed when I'm dead. A chance to visit your son, who you have failed to prioritize a visit for more than 2 years, can't be taken when I'm dead. It's that simple. And now I can say as a fact, my parents never bothered to visit me while living abroad for 7 years. Would it be conceivable to a loving parent not to make the effort to visit their child for 7 years while they're living abroad? No, it simply wouldn't. So, harking back to the philosophy my parents seem to have subscribed to, why would they expect me not to make the same effort as they have in necessitating a relationship with me? So, that's the final story. If you're still tuned in at this point, I'm actually impressed, as I imagine there was a lot to process from what I had to say or what I had to write about. So I guess you're wondering how my mum responded. So I'm sorry to disappoint you, but her response was somewhat anticlimactical. She read through the first paragraph, figured out what I was trying to do, and refused to read the rest. So we're in 2025 and my mother still hasn't read it. To say that her decision not to read it has fractured our relationship would be an understatement. But this is my position. When my mother is ready to read it, I know that she will be ready to prioritize me in the way that I need her to. Until then, I cannot and will not let her be a priority in my life. As I have said at the beginning of this episode, I have inherently forgiven my parents, which is why I don't hate them, and would always leave an opportunity for my parents to rekindle our relationship. I don't know what that would look like with my father, as I view him as an incredibly enigmatic individual, but I know what that would look like for my mother. Now, it is a possibility that my mum has read the letter, but until she's ready to talk about it, I cannot see a relationship with her being an asset to my life. I've obviously ruminated on these experiences and their effects, and have come to a point where I can truly forgive them, but that doesn't mean that I have to forget about how they made me feel. It took me a while, but I've learned to prioritize myself and put myself first. In order to do this, I can't allow people back into my life who haven't reassured me that I am a priority to them. So that's where I am today. I could be wrong and could be processing this unhealthily, but my intuition and experience is telling me that my approach is sanitary and reasonable. And until I feel differently, I'm pretty sure that I will only continue to welcome people into my life who value me as I value myself. So I'll leave it there. And once again, thank you for listening, most especially if you listened all the way through it or listened to all of it. And I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.